Okay, so for reading for week 4 of mental health, Tom's asked us to look up some examples of conditions, psychiatric conditions that involve delusions. So the first one is clinical lycanthropy, which involves the delusion that a person can transform into, or has transformed into, or is a non-human animal. It's connected with the mythical idea of lycanthropy, which is being a werewolf. They have a delusional belief that they're in the process of transforming into an animal, or they've already transformed into an animal. And it's been linked with the altered states of mind that accompany psychosis. So I assume that means it's not a psychosis, but it's linked with. But it typically involves delusions and hallucinations, with the transformation only seeming to happen in the mind and behaviour of the affected person. Some diagnostic criteria. The patient reports in a moment of lucidity or looking back that he feels like an animal or has felt like one. And they behave in a manner that resembles an animal, like crying and grunting and creeping. It doesn't seem like it's specific to the human wolf experience. There's a variety of creatures that have been reported. It's a review from early 2004, which lists over 30 cases of lycanthropy. Only a minority have been wolf or dog themed. There's also other animals: hyenas, cats, horses, birds, tigers. So it's largely considered to be an idiosyncratic expression of a psychotic episode caused by another condition such as schizophrenia or bipolar or clinical depression. There's some suggestions that certain neurological and cultural influences, though. It might be changes in the brain known to be representing body shape, for instance. A neuroimaging study of 2 people diagnosed with clinical lycanthropy showed that these areas displayed unusual activation, suggesting that when people report their bodies changing shape, they may genuinely be perceiving those feelings. So the second one is Jerusalem syndrome, which is a group of mental phenomena involving the presence of either religiously themed obsessive ideas, delusions, or other psychosis, like experiences that are triggered by a visit to the city of Jerusalem. It's not endemic to one single religion or denomination. It's affected Jews, Christians and Muslims of many different backgrounds. The best known manifestation is where people who seem previously balanced and don't have any signs of psychopathology just become psychotic after arriving in Jerusalem, but this isn't the most common kind. And Barrell et al. 2000 claimed to have identified and described a specific syndrome which emerges in tourists with no previous psychiatric history, but that was disputed by Callion and Whitson. Because apparently Barrell et al. Had no evidence that the tourists had been well before their arrival in the city. And Jerusalem syndrome isn't listed or referenced in the DSM-4. So in the additional homework, Tom's written that an issue is that delusions have to be identified by someone other than the person reporting them, so a clinician, for example. This means that the clinician inevitably has to make judgments about what is or isn't a reasonable belief. It's led to some historical events where individuals have been classed as deluded and treated as mentally ill for what actually turned out to be the truth. So an example of this is the Martha Mitchell effect. So Martha Mitchell was the wife of an American general attorney, and she kept reporting corruption of the Nixon White House. They were dismissed as evidence of delusional thinking until later the Watergate investigation they proved to be true. And it says that these examples demonstrate that delusional pathology can often lie in the failure of, or inability to verify whether or not events have actually taken place, no matter how improbable they actually are. And Burke 1998 wrote that even paranoids have enemies. And also, for understandable and obvious reasons, little efforts invested into checking the validity of claims of prosecution or harassment, and without evidence, the patient just is labelled delusional. And the DSM-4 actually distinguishes bizarre delusions and non-bizarre delusions. So bizarre delusions are generally impossible, whereas non-bizarre delusions are generally improbable. So a non-bizarre delusion might actually occur in real life, but are thought to be highly improbable and potentially falsifiable by the psychiatrist. However, a bizarre or fantastic belief is considered to be impossible and assumed not to be one held by others in cultural society. And the DSM doesn't really tell you how to set about establishing the falseness or bizarreness of the belief. There is also Rosenham's 1973 experiment on being sane in insane places. Looked at this at A-level. Basically, it involved putting healthy associates who pretended they had auditory hallucinations into 12 different psychiatric hospitals in the US. And they were all admitted and diagnosed with psychiatric disorders. And then straight after admission, they just acted normally and told staff they felt fine and hadn't experienced any more hallucinations. And they were all forced to admit having a mental disorder and agreed to take antipsychotics as a condition of their release. After that, one of the facilities kind of challenged Rosenham to send other pseudo-patients into the hospital and said that his staff would detect them. He did agree, and the staff identified 41 potential pseudo-patients when he'd actually sent no one to the hospital. So Tom's asked us to look up 3 examples of psychiatric diagnoses that are associated with psychoses. So first of all, we've got schizophrenia, that's an obvious one. We've also got bipolar disorder, which is also called manic depression. And you can get psychosis during severe depression. And this is from the NHS website, and it says that the underlying cause will often influence the type of psychotic episode that someone experiences. So, for example, people with bipolar are more likely to have delusions of grandeur, whereas people with depression are more likely to develop paranoid delusions. They're also more likely to kind of have auditory hallucinations, making negative comments and things like that. Another condition that I looked at is schizoaffective disorder, which shares the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia and the mood disturbances of bipolar disorder and depression. Currently in the DSM-4, it recognises patients with schizoaffective disorder as those whose mood symptoms are sufficiently severe to warrant a diagnosis of depression or another full-blown mood disorder, and whose mood symptoms overlap at some period with psychotic symptoms that satisfy the diagnosis of schizophrenia. The term's been applied to lots of different patient groups over the years though, so it's not really carried a salient definition. This says that a lot of researchers believe that some people have a biological predisposition to schizophrenia, and that varies along a continuum of severity, but that can be a cause. Okay, so he also asked us to find examples of general medical conditions. This is just from the NHS website, which I assume is going to be dated, it's dated 2012, so NHS 2012. And this talks about general medical conditions that have been known to trigger psychotic episodes. It mentions HIV and AIDS, malaria, syphilis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, hypoglycemia, lupus, Lyme disease, multiple sclerosis and brain tumour. And it might maybe be helpful to give a short explanation. This NHS website also talks about substances that can trigger a psychotic episode, so alcohol and drugs, things like cocaine, speed, crystal meth, so amphetamines, methamphetamines, loads of different ones. It says it can also be triggered if you suddenly stop taking a drug or drinking alcohol after a long time, and that's known as withdrawal. It says that in rare situations, some medications can cause psychosis as a side effect, or an overdose of the medication, and it uses levodopa as an example of this. Right, so Tom's asked us to look up other communication phenomena that are associated with thought disorder. It's asked to find 2 or 3 examples. So the first one I found is of clanging, which is excessive rhyming or alliteration in a way that doesn't really make sense. So there might not be any actual meaning behind it. For example, many mouldy mushrooms emerge out of mildewy mud on Mondays. Or I heard the bell, well hell, then I fell. Another one is self-reference, which is inappropriately referring back to the self. So the example on Wikipedia is when asked what the time is, someone says it's 7 o'clock, that's my problem. And the third is of stilted speech, so this is speech that's characterised by the use of words or phrases that are flowery and excessive or pompous. So the example here is, the attorney comported himself incredulously. So the last extra reading exercise, Tom said the communication issues associated with thought disorder are of interest to linguists and psychologists, who have suggested various causes for these. They include the unusual communication features being simply the result of an underlying disordered mind, or maybe the unusual communication features might not be about the disordered mind at all, but represent co-occurring transient language disorders like aphasia, or sort of like aphasia, or that the communication disorders might result from a combination of both language disorders and disordered mind. But he says that there's many others in other fields, like psychiatrists and psychotherapists, who suggest that instead it's probably best understood completely differently as a sort of protective state of mind rather than just a disorder, or rather than a disorder at all. So the last bit of reading is this piece by Covington et al. And it's from 2005. and it's a critical review of the literature on language in schizophrenia. And it looks through schizophrenic language in different levels in terms of phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics and pragmatics. It says there's at least two kinds of impairment, there's thought disorder or failure to maintain a discourse plan, and schizophasia, which is comprised of various dysphagia-like, so aphasia-like impairments such as clanging and neologisms and unintelligible utterances. It says that thought disorder appears to be primarily a disruption of executive function and pragmatics, with maybe an impairment of syntax-semantics interface, but schizophrenia involves disruption at other levels. So the phonetics is often abnormal, so they might have flat intonation or unusual voice quality, but then there's also phonological structure and morphology and syntax, which are normal or nearly so. The access to lexicons clearly impaired and manifests as stilted speech, word approximation and neologism, and clanging, they say, is straightforwardly explainable by as a distraction by self-monitoring. It lastly makes the point that recent research has begun to relate schizophrenia to genetic endowment that makes human language possible. So that's Covington et al., and it's 2005. So another paper that I've read is this one by Darren Palmer, 2000, and it talks about the debate over how delusions are identified. So it says how the DSM refers to delusions as incorrect inferences about external reality, but it says from a social constructionist perspective, delusions can be reconceptualised as the product of a power relationship in which the views of a less powerful patient are pathologised. So that's Palmer, 2000. So the last thing I'm going to look at is this paper by McCabe and Preeb, and it covers issues about the ways in which psychiatrists speak to or communicate with people with psychotic symptoms. So it gives this example of one patient asking, "Why don't people believe me when I say I'm God?" And the doctor kind of avoids it, and then after a while replies, "What should I say now?" But it says that in interaction with patients with psychosis, initial avoidance by clinicians seems to lead to explicit confrontation, and then that can lead to patients who aren't well engaged being further disengaged during treatment. And it goes on to say that there's little systematic, theoretically informed training on how clinicians should respond. So there's not really many guidelines on how you should communicate with people with psychosis. Because obviously you don't want to encourage the patient to talk about symptoms, because many say that it amounts to inadvertent collusion about the illness. So the McCabe and Preeb 2008, it goes on to talk about interventions to improve communication. So it talks about one by Van Os et al., which was a communication checklist completed by patients before seeing their clinician, and Van Os et al. Found that it improved communication and resulted in treatment changes. And that again is Van Os et al., 2004. There's another one by Preeb et al., 2001, and that structured patient key worker communication and elicited the patient's satisfaction with a range of life domains and their needs for care and wishes for help. And the patients receiving the intervention had a better quality of life, fewer needs for care, higher treatment satisfaction after 1 year. But they point out that it remains unclear whether the structuring or the focusing on the patient's view or the emphasis on treatment changes or a combination were what made the intervention successful. There was also another study where there was an intervention to increase shared decision making in patients with schizophrenia, and they found that it didn't actually take up more of the doctor's time to do this increased decision making, and it increased the uptake of psychoeducation, and it increased the involvement in medical decisions. So this McCabe and Priebe 2008, they suggest that future research might address matching patients with the right clinicians to achieve the best possible communication, and they go on to recommend that psychiatrists should strive to develop better competence skills to maximise its therapeutic effect in terms of everyday communication.